A Garmer's claw, thick as a spear shaft, tears through the stone ceiling. The cavern floor erupts in a spray of jagged slate and pulverized bone. Arvid Vinter watches as his brother is hoisted into the suffocating dark. The creature's hide shimmers with scales that absorb the light of the torches. A primitive wooden spear shatters against the beast's flank like a dry twig. Iron and blood taste like copper on the tongue of the dying. The taste of sulfur becomes the only promise of salvation in this tomb. Arvid stood frozen as the Garmer vanished into the upper shadows. His brother's scream echoed once, then clipped into a wet silence. The cavern walls dripped with condensation and cold, ancient moss. He looked down at his own hands, trembling and coated in red dust. He gripped a shard of broken spear, the wood splintered and useless. The tribe's weapons were nothing more than toys against such armor. He turned his gaze to the damp corner where the bats nested. Bat guano crusted the floor in thick, pungent layers of white salt. Arvid scraped the substance into a hollowed-out gourd with a jagged stone. He mixed the filth with crushed cave moss and dried, charcoal-rich wood. The mixture turned a sickly, dark gray in the dim torchlight. He knew the properties of these elements from forbidden, scrawled scrolls. The air in the cave grew heavy with the sharp, acidic scent of decay. He packed the powder tightly into a sealed, hardened clay vessel. A fuse of woven hair and dried bark protruded from the top. He ignited the end with a flickering flame from his torch. The sparks danced toward the vessel like tiny, hungry insects. Arvid retreated behind a massive, calcified stalagmite near the tunnel mouth. He pressed his palms against his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. The silence of the cave felt heavy, waiting for a violent conclusion. A blinding flash of white light tore through the subterranean gloom. The explosion roared, a concussive wave that rattled the very bedrock. Debris rained down, burying the tunnel entrance in a cloud of dust. Arvid tumbled backward, his ears ringing with a high, piercing whine. The smell of ozone and burnt sulfur filled the narrow passage. He crawled forward, his chest heaving as he tasted metallic ash. The wall where he had placed the device was now a jagged crater. The Garmer's blood, black and viscous, pooled on the shattered stone. Jorunn Hest emerged from the darkness with a group of armed hunters. Her face was a mask of cold, calculated fury as she saw the destruction. Thorstein Skjold stood at her shoulder, his spear leveled at Arvid's throat. The matriarch pointed a steady finger at the smoking, ruined wall. She whispered that such fire was a heresy against the tribe's survival. The hunters tightened their circle, their eyes filled with primal fear. Arvid scrambled to his feet, holding the remaining vials of dust. His left hand bore a deep, chemical burn from the volatile reaction. The skin had bubbled into raw, weeping sores that pulsed with heat. He realized the cost of his invention was more than just his status. Thorstein stepped forward, his knuckles white around his spear grip. He demanded that the outcast be cast into the surface wasteland tonight. Jorunn watched the flickering shadows, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. She offered Arvid a choice that hung in the stagnant, humid air. He could walk into the hunting grounds alone with nothing but his tools, or he could face the judgment of the elders at the next dawn. Execution meant a slow death in the deepest, darkest pits of the abyss. Exile meant a fast death in the jaws of the apex predators above. Arvid looked at the glowing embers of his crude, lethal creation. He knew the chemistry was sound, even if his body was failing. He chose the surface, turning his back on the only home he knew. He grabbed a leather satchel and stuffed his remaining supplies inside. The cave exit was a narrow, vertical shaft leading toward the sky. He climbed the slick walls, his fingers slipping on the mossy stone. Above him, the air changed, losing the smell of damp, rotting earth. The wind howled with a predatory hunger that made his skin crawl. He reached the surface and felt the brutal bite of an alien sun. The Kalen tribe remained below, trapped in their cycle of fear. Arvid walked into the tall, swaying grass of the unknown archipelago. The ground trembled under the weight of something massive nearby. He clutched the satchel to his chest, his lungs burning with every breath. He was a scientist in a world that had forgotten the meaning of fire. He was a target in a world that treated humans as mobile livestock. The horizon stretched out, filled with the shadows of giant, shifting shapes. The taste of sulfur was a warning, and he was the only one listening. The surface wind whipped sand against Arvid's face like tiny needles. He stumbled through a field of razor grass that stood taller than a man. His satchel hung heavy against his hip, leaking a thin trail of dark gray powder. Behind him, a low, chattering sound echoed from the jagged rock formations. A scavenger lizard crept from the shadows, its skin a mottled, sickly shade of yellow. It moved with a twitchy, rhythmic gait that signaled a predator on the hunt. Arvid dropped to his knees, his breath hitching in his chest. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a crude bamboo-reinforced tube. The vessel was sealed with hardened mud and a length of woven hair. His hands shook, the chemical burns from the cave still weeping a clear, viscous fluid. The lizard lunged, its jaws snapping open to reveal rows of serrated, needle-like teeth. Arvid jammed the fuse against a jagged flintstone, sparking a tiny ember. He shoved the device forward, aiming blindly at the creature's armored chest. A dull thud sounded, followed by a violent, concussive boom that rocked his frame. The recoil slammed into his arm with the force of a falling boulder. A sharp, sickening crack vibrated through his shoulder as his radius bone snapped. Arvid collapsed, his vision blurring into jagged streaks of white and gray. The lizard shrieked, its chest cavity shattered by the force of the blast. It thrashed against the dirt, black blood soaking into the parched earth. Arvid clutched his limp arm, the bone beneath the skin jutting at an unnatural angle. He tasted copper and bile, the familiar tang of his own broken body. The pain radiated from his wrist to his neck, pulsing like a dying star. He dragged himself toward a cluster of oversized ferns to hide his trail. A shadow fell over him, blocking out the harsh, alien sun. He looked up, expecting the jaws of another predator. Instead, a human scout knelt in the grass, his skin painted with tribal mud. The man held a spear, but the tip was blunted and worn from years of use. Blood trickled from a deep gash on the scout's thigh. The scout stared at the smoking tube in Arvid's broken hand. He spoke in a raspy whisper, asking if the fire came from the gods. Arvid shook his head, his teeth gritted against the agony in his arm. He gestured to the dead lizard, its armor shredded by the explosion. The scout's eyes widened, the fear replaced by a flicker of desperate hope. He confessed that his patrol had been decimated by a pack of smaller raptors. He offered Arvid a chance to return to the Kalan tribe's hidden tunnels. The condition was simple: demonstrate the fire dust's power to the elders. Arvid looked at his shattered wrist, the skin swelling into a bruised purple mass. He nodded once. A silent pact formed in the shadow of the dying predator. The scout hoisted Arvid onto his shoulders, their movements slow and pained. They moved toward the mountain range, avoiding the open plains where the sovereigns hunted. Arvid clutched his satchel with his good hand, feeling the weight of the remaining sulfur. Every step sent waves of fire through his broken arm. He watched the horizon, noting the way the giant shifting shapes moved in the distance. The sovereigns were not mindless beasts. They tracked the scent of human fear. He realized the fire dust was a double-edged blade. It promised protection, but it left a trail of sound that invited death. He needed to stabilize the propellant, or the recoil would kill him before the predators did. The scout stumbled, his own wound leaving a dark, wet trail in the dust. They reached the base of a sheer limestone cliff. A narrow, hidden crevice pulsed with the faint, warm glow of torchlight. The scout tapped a rhythmic code against the stone wall. A section of the rock groaned, sliding open to reveal a dark, subterranean passage. Jorun Hest stood at the entrance, her expression unreadable in the flickering gloom. She looked at Arvid's shattered arm and the scorched remains of the bamboo tube. She commanded the guards to bring the alchemist into the judgment chamber. Arvid walked past the rows of stone-faced hunters, his boots dragging on the wet floor. The air in the tunnels smelled of stale water and the fear of the trapped. He reached the center of the pit, where the elders sat in a circle of shadow. Torstein Skjold stepped forward, his spear tip resting inches from Arvid's throat. The hunter mocked the broken man, calling the fire a curse that brought only ruin. Arvid raised his good hand, holding a small, unsealed vial of the gray powder. He dared them to look at the power that could strip the armor from a sovereign. Jorun leaned forward, her eyes catching the dim light of the central hearth. She asked if he could replicate the blast without destroying his own bones. Arvid stared at the matriarch, knowing the truth would seal his fate. He admitted the cost was high, but the survival of the tribe was higher. The chamber fell silent. The only sound, the distant drip of water on stone. He was an outcast, a cripple, and a man fueled by forbidden science. He was the only one who realized the Kalan were already dead if they stayed hidden. He began to explain the chemistry, his voice cracking from the fumes in his lungs. The elders watched him, their hands tight on their traditional, useless weapons. Arvid knew the toll was just beginning. He looked at the dark ceiling, the weight of the mountain pressing down on his resolve. He would build the fire dust, or he would die in the dark trying. The stone floor of the judgment chamber dampened the sound of Arvid's limping gait. Jorun Hest sat upon a throne of carved obsidian, her eyes reflecting the dying embers of the central hearth. She gestured toward the satchel at Arvid's hip. The leather bag sagged under the weight of the remaining sulfur and charcoal. Torstein Skjold stood at her right hand, his fingers tracing the edge of a jagged bone spear. He spat on the ground near Arvid's boots. Jorunn commanded Arvid to surrender the volatile powder to the elders immediately. She warned that the fire dust brought nothing but the scent of death to their hidden sanctuary. Arvid clutched the satchel tighter with his good hand. He looked at the council, his jaw set in a line of stubborn defiance. He explained that their spears were mere toothpicks against the chitinous hides of the sovereigns. Torstein laughed, a harsh sound that echoed against the damp cavern walls. He challenged Arvid to prove the worth of his alchemy before the entire assembly. A scout burst into the chamber, his breathing ragged and his face smeared with fresh mud. He shouted that a pack of raptors had breached the outer ventilation shafts. The chamber erupted into a chaotic flurry of movement. Torstein seized the opportunity to force Arvid's hand. He shoved Arvid toward the tunnel entrance, daring him to turn the tide of the raid. Arvid stumbled into the narrow corridor, his broken arm throbbing with every erratic step. The smell of ozone and wet fur filled the cramped stone passage. He reached into his satchel, his fingers brushing the coarse grain of the sulfur. The raptors moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, their claws clicking against the limestone floor. They were smaller than the Garmer, but faster, their eyes glowing with a predatory, intelligent hunger. Arvid positioned his makeshift tube, his heart hammering against his ribs. He braced the device against a protruding stalagmite to compensate for his injured shoulder. Torstein watched from the shadows, his expression twisted into a predatory smirk. He tripped a lever on the tunnel wall, releasing a heavy iron grate that blocked Arvid's retreat. Arvid poured the powder into the tube, his hands shaking from the immense pain in his wrist. He struck the flint, a spark jumping into the open breech of the weapon. The device hissed, a thin trail of gray smoke spiraling toward the ceiling. It did not detonate with the roar he expected. A violent, sickening sputter choked the tube, followed by a blinding cloud of acrid yellow ash. The mixture was damp, the humidity of the caves having leached the potency from the saltpeter. Arvid coughed, his lungs burning as he inhaled the toxic, sulfurous cloud. The raptors paused, their heads tilting in unison as they processed the sudden, choking fog. Torstein stepped into the light, his spear raised high for a killing blow. He mocked the alchemist, calling the fire dust a coward's toy. Arvid collapsed to his knees, his vision blurring as the chemical fumes seared his throat. The tube lay shattered on the floor, its contents spilling into the muck of the tunnel. He realized the environment had betrayed him, the moisture of the deep earth turning his salvation into poison. The raptors lunged, their teeth snapping inches from his face. A roar shook the ceiling, far louder than any weapon Arvid had ever forged. The lead raptor skidded to a halt, sensing something far larger moving in the deep tunnels. Torstein froze, his eyes widening as he looked toward the dark abyss of the lower levels. The raid was forgotten as the true apex of the archipelago asserted its dominance. Arvid crawled backward, his fingers scraping against the cold, unyielding stone. He looked at the spilled powder, the gray grains now useless sludge in the tunnel water. His credibility lay in ruins, shattered like the bone in his arm. Jorunn appeared at the edge of the light, her face a mask of cold, calculating judgment. She watched the empty tube, her silence heavier than the threat of the predators. Torstein retreated into the darkness, leaving Arvid alone in the center of the killing floor. The alchemist stared at the ceiling, the weight of his failure pressing down on his chest. He had promised fire, but he had delivered only ash and a target on his own back. The struggle for survival had turned into a desperate, losing game of attrition. He needed more than just a spark. He needed a way to master the damp, suffocating world. The raptors retreated into the shadows, sensing the arrival of the Garmer. Arvid stood slowly, his body protesting every movement with a sharp, white-hot sting. He picked up a handful of the ruined powder, letting it run through his bloodied fingers. The lesson was etched into his mind with the permanence of a scar. He would not be underestimated again, even if he had to burn the entire mountain to prove his logic. The elders watched him from the gloom, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. Arvid walked past them, his head bowed, his mind already calculating the next, more dangerous synthesis. The judgment of the tribe had begun, and he was the only one who understood the true cost of their survival. Arvid sat in the dim corner of the storage grotto. His hands were empty, the satchel stripped of every vial and grain. Torstein stood over him, his spear tip resting inches from Arvid's throat. The tribe's protector spat on the cavern floor. He mocked the alchemist, calling his failed fire dust a useless parlor trick. Jorunn entered the grotto with a heavy, rhythmic gait. She commanded Arvid to join the gatherers for the daily water collection. Arvid stood up, his broken arm tucked tight against his ribs. His skin felt pale and clammy from the lingering sulfur sickness. He walked toward the cavern exit, his boots scraping against loose shale. The tribe moved in silence, a procession of shadows against the rock. Thorstein followed behind, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. They emerged into the main tunnel, where the air grew damp and cold. Water dripped from jagged stalactites, echoing like distant rhythmic heartbeats. Arvid watched the walls, noting the fine layer of bioluminescent moss. The gatherers reached the subterranean reservoir, a vast pool of black glass. Thorstein signaled for them to stop, his hand gripping his spear tight. He shoved Arvid toward the water's edge, forcing him to act as bait. Arvid knelt by the pool, his eyes fixed on the rippling reflection. He saw the silhouette of a sovereign moving in the high ceiling vents. The creature did not sniff the air, though the humans were exposed. It stayed perfectly still, its chitinous plates blending into the dark stone. Arvid watched the sovereign's throat pulse, sensing the vibration of a drip. The creature turned its massive head toward the sound of a falling pebble. Arvid's breath hitched, the realization striking him like a physical blow. The Garmer were blind to scent in the presence of loud, chaotic noise. He looked at the gathered water skins, heavy and filled with liquid. Thorstein prepared to strike a flint to light the emergency torches. Arvid lunged forward, knocking the flint from the hunter's calloused hand. The metal sparked against the ground, a tiny flash in the gloom. Thorstein roared in anger, raising his spear to strike the alchemist down. Arvid pointed toward the ceiling, his finger trembling with sudden urgency. The sovereign shifted, its claws digging deep into the soft limestone. It ignored the human scent, focusing entirely on the sound of the scuffle. The tribe froze, the silence in the cavern becoming absolute and suffocating. Arvid grabbed a jagged stone and hurled it into the far tunnel. The rock clattered against the wall, a sharp, piercing sound in the void. The sovereign lunged toward the noise, its body a streak of dark motion. The creature's tail smashed into the stalactites, showering them with debris. Arvid pulled the gatherers back, his eyes tracking the predator's path. He saw the creature's weakness in the way it relied on auditory input. Thorstein lowered his spear, his face a mask of stunned, quiet disbelief. Arvid looked at the cavern ceiling, already mapping the structural weak points. He needed the weight of the mountain to trap the beast below. The tribe retreated, leaving the sovereign to hunt the echo of the stone. Arvid walked back to the grotto, his mind racing with new calculations. He would not need gunpowder to kill the beast if he used the cave. He reached the entrance and looked back at the darkness one last time. The hunt had changed, and he was finally the one holding the map. Jorunn watched him from the shadows, her expression unreadable and cold. Arvid ignored her gaze, his focus locked on the architecture of the tunnel. He began to scratch a diagram into the dirt with his fingernail. The geometry of the collapse was simple, provided he had enough leverage. He counted the remaining hours until the next cycle of the Garmer hunt. The survival of the gatherers depended on the precision of his trap. He wiped the dirt from his hands and leaned back against the wall. His body ached, but the fog in his mind had finally cleared. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic dripping of the cave water. Every drop was a second closer to the moment of his final strike. The cavern floor trembled with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Dust rained from the jagged ceiling, coating the tribe in a fine gray shroud. Arvid gripped his makeshift detonator, his knuckles white against the cold stone. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the cavern walls. The Garmer emerged from the shadows, its chitinous plates shimmering like oil on black water. Its eyes were slits of burning amber, locked onto the huddled mass of the Kalen tribe. Jorunn stood before her people, her spear shaking in her calloused hands. Thorstein crouched to her left, his eyes darting toward the only exit. The sovereign took a step forward, its massive claws gouging deep furrows into the rock. Arvid looked at the wall of crates stacked behind the beast. They held the entire winter supply of gathered tubers and dried fish. They also held his remaining stockpile of volatile sulfur and charcoal dust. The beast snapped its jaws, the sound echoing like a closing iron gate. Arvid knew the chemistry of the mountain better than any living soul. He calculated the blast radius in his head, his breath hitching in his chest. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and ancient, musk-heavy decay. Arvid crawled toward the hidden fuse, his fingers brushing the rough, uneven ground. He reached the primary ignition point, a trail of black powder leading into the dark. The Garmer tilted its head, sensing the slight movement in the shadows. It turned its massive, armored neck toward the alchemist. Arvid struck the flint, the spark dancing for a heartbeat in the gloom. The powder ignited, a thin line of orange fire snaking toward the crates. The sovereign lunged, its body a blur of lethal prehistoric muscle. Arvid rolled to the side, his shoulder slamming into a jagged pillar. The fuse reached the stack of crates, the reaction instantaneous and violent. A concussive boom rocked the cavern, knocking everyone to their knees. The force of the blast ripped through the air, carrying shards of stone and fire. The sovereign let out a high, piercing shriek that rattled the very teeth of the tribe. Its armor cracked under the pressure, the chitinous plates splintering into dark fragments. The ceiling groaned, the weight of the mountain shifting in response to the fire. Giant stalactites sheared away from the rock, plummeting toward the struggling beast. Dust clouds engulfed the cavern, turning the world into a blinding, suffocating haze. Arvid shielded his eyes, his lungs burning with the acrid, sulphurous smoke. The ground bucked one final time, then settled into a heavy, ominous silence. Where the Garmer had stood, only a pile of crushed rubble and debris remained. The tribe coughed, their voices muffled by the heavy veil of pulverized stone. Joran stood up slowly, her silhouette framed by the dim, flickering torchlight. She looked toward the back of the grotto, where their food stores used to be. The crates were gone, buried under a mountain of fallen granite. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the sound of dripping water. Torstein climbed over a pile of loose rocks, his face streaked with soot. He stared at the burial site, his jaw set in a grim, hard line. The threat of the sovereign was gone, replaced by the gnawing shadow of hunger. Arvid leaned against the cavern wall, his strength finally deserting him. He looked at his stained hands, the chemical burns stinging in the cold air. The tribe members began to sift through the rubble, searching for any salvageable scrap. Their movements were slow, weighted by the sudden, terrifying realization of their loss. Joran turned to look at Arvid, her gaze cold and devoid of any gratitude. She held a handful of ruined, dust-covered grain, letting it slip through her fingers. Arvid lowered his head, the weight of his victory pressing down on his tired shoulders. He had saved their lives, but he had stolen their future. The flickering torches cast long, wavering shadows across the barren grotto. The tribe huddled together, the warmth of the fire gone with their stores. Arvid watched the darkness, his mind already drifting to the next impossible calculation. He knew the mountain had more to give, if he only had the strength to take it. The echoes of the blast faded into the deep, uncaring hum of the earth. He closed his eyes, his breath shallow and ragged in the stagnant air. The hunt for survival had only just begun. The cavern air tasted of bitter ash and stale desperation. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of the Kalan tribe. Children curled into tight balls against the cold stone floor. Jorun stood in the center of the grotto with her arms crossed tightly. She glared at Arvid, her eyes cold as winter ice. Arvid leaned against the damp wall, his lungs wheezing with every shallow breath. His hands shook, stained black with the chemical residue of his last failed invention. Around him, the tribe whispered words of betrayal and starvation. Torstein stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the jagged floor. He held a sharpened obsidian spear, the tip glistening in the dim torchlight. The hunter gestured toward the empty storage pits, now filled with rubble. Torstein accused the alchemist of killing their future for a moment of noise. Arvid looked up, his gaze steady despite the tremors in his tired body. He reached into his tunic, pulling out a crude, iron-bound pistol. The weapon was a heavy, lopsided thing, held together with strips of cured hide. It was a prototype, a desperate gamble forged from scavenged scraps. Torstein laughed, a harsh sound that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. He mocked the small metal tube as a toy for a broken man. The hunter shifted his stance, his muscles coiled for a lethal strike. Joran stepped back, her face a mask of grim, silent judgment. The tribe formed a wide, uneven circle around the two men. Torstein lunged first, his spear whistling through the thick, stagnant air. Arvid pivoted, his boots sliding on the loose, gritty stone. He raised the pistol with his one good hand, his fingers sweating against the grip. The flint clicked, a sharp, metallic snap that cut through the silence. A spark danced near the touch hole, catching the volatile dust inside. Torstein didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the alchemist's throat. The pistol roared, a blinding flash of orange light erupting in the gloom. A cloud of sulphurous smoke billowed, stinging the eyes of everyone watching. The recoil slammed into Arvid's shoulder, throwing him backward against the rock. He gasped, his vision swimming as the smell of burnt propellant filled his nose. Torstein stumbled, his spear clattering to the ground with a dull thud. A jagged gouge marred the wooden shaft of his weapon, splintered by the force. The hunter stared at his trembling hands, his face pale with sudden raw shock. He looked at the small, smoking barrel of Arvid's invention. The tribe fell silent, the weight of the realization settling over the grotto. Arvid wiped a trickle of blood from his nose, his expression unreadable. He stood up slowly, clutching the pistol to his chest like a holy relic. Jorun watched him, her hand hovering near the dagger at her belt. She saw the power in the smoke, the potential for a new kind of survival. Arvid stepped toward the center of the circle, his voice rasping in the quiet. He told them that the era of hiding in the dark was over. He pointed to the tunnel entrance, where the shadows of the world waited. Thorstein backed away, his prestige shattered by the thunder of the black powder. The tribe looked to Jorun, their hunger battling with their newfound fear. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion that sealed Arvid's authority. The alchemist walked past them, his footsteps heavy on the cavern floor. He needed more sulfur, more charcoal, more ways to turn the earth into fire. His lungs burned, a constant reminder of the price he paid for every blast. He didn't look back at the tribe as he retreated to his corner. The flickering torches cast long, wavering shapes against the cave walls. Arvid sat down and began to clean his pistol with a scrap of hide. He knew the sovereigns would return, drawn by the scent of human desperation. He would be ready, even if the effort burned the very life from his bones. The cave floor felt cold against Arvid's knees. Blood dripped from his nose and pooled in the dust. His left eye pulsed with a sharp, rhythmic agony. The world blurred into a smear of orange torchlight and dark stone. Thorstein lay slumped against the far wall. The hunter's obsidian spear rested in two jagged pieces. Jorun watched from the shadows with a face carved from granite. She gripped her dagger, her knuckles white against the dark hide. Arvid reached up to touch his face. His fingers came away slick with dark, viscous fluid. The skin around his left socket felt raw and melted. A thin gray smoke drifted from the pistol in his right hand. The barrel was cracked and blackened by the last ignition. He stared at the weapon through his remaining eye. It was a crude, lethal failure of engineering. The tribe stood in a circle, their breath hitching in the silence. They looked at Arvid, not with awe, but with a primal, quiet dread. He stood up on trembling legs, his vision tilted as a wave of nausea rolled through his gut. He knew then that his body was a failing vessel. The chemical burns on his lungs tightened with every shallow breath. He walked toward the center of the grotto, dragging his feet. Every step sent a jolt of fire through his skull. He dropped the pistol into the dirt at Jorun's feet. The heavy metal clattered against the stone floor. Jorun looked down at the weapon, then back at his ruined face. She demanded to know if this was the price of his fire. Arvid wiped his hands on his tunic, ignoring the sting of the grit. He told her that fire always demanded a sacrifice. He pointed to the dark tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. He explained that strength would never defeat the sovereign beasts. The tribe huddled closer to the dying embers of their fire. They listened as he described a world of iron and thunder. He spoke of mass production, of hundreds of barrels firing at once. His voice was a rasping, broken whisper in the cavern. He knew he could no longer fight with his own hands. He needed the others to build the tools he could no longer craft. Thorstein groaned and pushed himself up from the wall. The hunter's chest heaved, his eyes wide with lingering shock. He looked at the alchemist with a newfound bitter respect. Arvid turned his back on them and walked toward his corner. He sat on a pile of coarse, damp straw. He pulled a piece of cured leather over his left eye. The darkness on that side was absolute and permanent. He picked up a shard of flint and a piece of dry charcoal. He began to scratch calculations into the cave wall. The figures were jagged, desperate, and cold. He needed a more stable mix to prevent the backfire. He needed a way to protect the hands that would build the future. The tribe watched him from across the grotto. Jorun stood alone in the dim light, her gaze fixed on the alchemist. She saw the shadow of a man who had already traded his life for a weapon. Arvid leaned his head back against the jagged rock. He closed his one working eye for a moment of silence. The smell of sulfur clung to his skin like a second layer. He knew the sovereigns were out there, waiting in the dark. He felt the hum of the earth through the soles of his feet. The hunt had changed, and he was the one holding the spearhead. He opened his eye and stared at the flickering torch on the wall. He began to count the remaining supplies in his mind: sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, and the precious, lethal dust. He had enough for 10 charges, perhaps 12. He would need 100 to hold the mountain against the pack. The cave was quiet, save for the drip of water from the ceiling. He reached for a small stone mortar tucked beneath his bed. His hands shook as he measured out the black, gritty powder. He would refine the mixture until it burned clean and true. He would turn the entire tribe into a living wall of fire. The cost was his own flesh, a price he had already paid. He watched the dust settle into the stone bowl. The future was a dark, narrow path, and he was the only guide. He began to grind the materials, a slow, rhythmic sound in the dark. The tribe retreated to their sleeping spots, one by one. They left him alone with his fire and his ruined sight. Arvid worked until his fingers bled against the stone. He was the alchemist of a dying world. He was the architect of their final, desperate defense. The cavern felt smaller, tighter, as the shadows lengthened. He looked at his injured hand, now stiff and scarred. He would build a machine that did not require a steady palm. He would build a storm that the sovereigns could not outrun. The mountain groaned, a deep, tectonic rumble that shook the dust. Arvid didn't flinch, his focus locked on the grain of the powder. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun to evolve. The air in the back of the grotto hung heavy with sulphurous yellow haze. Arvid knelt on the cold floor, his single eye tracking the steady pulse of a mortar. 6 children sat in a semicircle around him, their faces smudged with soot. They held small stone pestles with hands that were far too small for the work. Arvid pointed to the pile of charcoal, his scarred finger trembling slightly. He signaled for them to grind the carbon into a fine velvet dust. The orphans mimicked his motions, their shoulders hunched against the damp chill. A sharp, hacking cough echoed through the cavern, vibrating against the limestone walls. The youngest girl, barely 7, wiped a streak of blood from her lower lip. Arvid looked at her, his expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. He knew the cost of the powder was etched into their delicate lungs. He pushed a small pouch of saltpeter across the floor toward the group. The white crystals caught the dim torchlight, sparkling like fallen stars. He warned them that the dust was a living poison if inhaled too deeply. They nodded in unison, their eyes wide and devoid of childhood wonder. He demonstrated the mixture ratio, his movements practiced and devoid of grace. The sound of grinding stone filled the chamber, a monotonous, rhythmic heartbeat. Outside the tunnel, a low, guttural hiss drifted in from the dark exterior. Arvid froze, his head cocking toward the jagged entrance of the cave. The children stopped their work, their small hands gripping the stone edges. He crawled to the edge of the shadows, his ears straining against the silence. The sound returned, a dry, clicking noise that did not belong to the wind. He saw a flash of iridescent feathers dart past the opening of the grotto. A pack of raptors moved through the undergrowth with unnatural, calculated grace. They did not shriek or hunt with the frantic energy of the scavenger lizards. They walked in a line, their heads bobbing in perfect, silent coordination. The lead predator stopped, its slit pupils dilating as it sniffed the air. It turned its snout away from the cave, ignoring the scent of the tribe. Arvid watched as the beast tilted its head, listening for a specific sound. The raptors were not hunting by scent, they were hunting by the rhythm. They had learned that the thunderfire only occurred when the grinding stopped. Arvid realized the pack was waiting for the silence to claim the cavern. He looked back at the children, who were huddled together in the dark. He ordered them to continue the grinding, his voice a sharp, urgent rasp. The sound of stone on stone resumed, masking the soft tread of claws. The raptor at the entrance let out a low, vibrating hum of frustration. It paced back and forth, its talons leaving deep gouges in the rock. Arvid reached for the half-finished pistol resting on his pile of straw. He checked the ignition mechanism, his thumb brushing the cold iron trigger. The device was a crude, dangerous solution to an impossible evolutionary problem. He could not fire without drawing the pack's immediate, lethal attention. The pack leader stepped into the archway, its scales shimmering with oily light. It stared into the darkness, its gaze locking onto the flickering torch flame. Arvid held his breath, his finger hovering over the rough metal lever. The children kept grinding, their faces pale and slick with cold sweat. The raptor took a step forward, its tail twitching with predatory tension. Arvid watched the beast's muscles coil, preparing for a sudden, lethal spring. He needed to create a distraction that didn't involve the sound of gunpowder. He grabbed a heavy loose stone and hurled it into the far corner. The rock shattered against the wall, creating a loud, echoing crash of debris. The raptor snapped its head toward the noise, its feathers bristling in alarm. The rest of the pack surged toward the distraction, their claws clicking sharply. Arvid stood up, his legs straining under the weight of his own exhaustion. He pointed to the tunnel leading deeper into the mountain's vein of ore. He urged the children to move, his gestures wide and frantic in the gloom. They scrambled into the darkness, their small feet silent on the damp floor. Arvid followed them, his one eye fixed on the entrance he had just vacated. The raptors tore into the pile of straw, their jaws snapping at the air. They sensed the deception, their heads turning back toward the inner cavern. Arvid felt the hum of the earth beneath his boots as they began to run. He knew the hunt had shifted from a test of strength to a game of wits. He reached the inner sanctum and collapsed against a wall of jagged basalt. The children gathered around him, their breathing ragged and filled with black soot. He looked at their hands, stained permanently with the ingredients of their defense. He knew that he was raising a generation of architects for a tomb. He picked up a piece of charcoal and began to sketch on the stone. He drew the anatomy of a trap, his lines precise and devoid of hesitation. If the predators were smart enough to wait, he would be smart enough to lead. He looked at the mortar bowl, now filled with a volatile gray sludge. The future of the Kalan tribe depended on the smoke they created today. He whispered to the children that they would build a wall of sound. They watched him with a strange, hollowed devotion that chilled his blood. Outside, the clicking of claws grew louder, echoing through the long stone corridor. The raptors had found their scent, and they were no longer afraid of the noise. Arvid stood up, his hand clutching the pistol until his knuckles went white. He prepared the final charge, his movements steady despite the pain in his chest. The hunt was evolving, and he was the architect of their final, desperate stand. The cavern's ceiling shivered as a deep, rhythmic vibration pulsed through the floor. Dust rained down from the stalactites like gray snow. Arvid Vinter clutched his side, his breath hitching in his constricted lungs. The tribe fell silent, their eyes wide with the familiar terror of the hunt. Jorunn Hest stood at the tunnel's mouth, her knuckles white against her spear shaft. Outside, the darkness of the ravine parted to reveal a massive, shifting silhouette. The Garmer stepped into the dim light of the mountain pass. Its hide was a map of jagged, silvery scars from Arvid's previous explosion. One eye was clouded over, white and sightless, yet it tracked the tribe with terrifying focus. It did not roar or charge into the fray. It simply stood there, blocking the only path back to the safety of the deep caves. Torstein Skjold raised his bronze-tipped spear, his muscles coiled for a desperate strike. The Garmer lowered its heavy, chitinous head, watching the hunter with a calculated, cold intelligence. It let out a low, guttural hiss that echoed against the canyon walls. From the shadows behind the beast, two smaller raptors emerged, their feathers sleek and dark. They flanked the Garmer, their bodies low to the ground in a perfect tactical formation. The tribe began to back away, their heels scraping against the loose shale. Arvid watched the beast's tail twitch, a slow, hypnotic movement that signaled a trap. The Garmer took a measured step forward, forcing the Kalan tribe toward the jagged edge of the cliff. The drop behind them was a sheer, hundreds-foot plunge into the jagged rocks below. Jorunn Hest signaled for the tribe to hold, her voice a strained whisper of command. The Garmer stopped, its snout twitching as it tasted the metallic tang of the air. It knew the tribe was running out of space. Arvid looked at his trembling hands, blackened by the soot of his chemical experiments. He reached into his satchel, his fingers brushing the cold, unstable clay of his last powder charge. The Garmer tilted its head, its remaining eye fixing directly on the Alchemist. It seemed to recognize the source of the fire that had burned its hide. The beast turned its gaze to the cliff edge, then back to the trapped humans. It was herding them like livestock, pushing them toward a final, fatal mistake. Torstein Skjold lunged forward, his spear whistling through the thin mountain air. The Garmer didn't flinch, its thick bio-armor absorbing the impact with a dull, metallic thud. The spear snapped in two, the tip clattering uselessly against the creature's scarred chest. The Garmer swiped a massive clawed hand, sending the hunter sprawling into the dust. The tribe screamed, a chorus of despair that shattered the tense silence of the pass. Arvid stepped between the beast and the fallen hunter, his lungs burning with every inhale. He uncorked the vial of sulfur, the yellow dust spilling onto his stained palms. The Garmer paused, its jaws parting to reveal rows of serrated, obsidian teeth. It waited, watching the Alchemist with the patience of a predator that had already won. Arvid realized the beast was not trying to eat them yet. It was waiting for the tribe to exhaust their options, to break their own resolve. He looked at the cliff, then at the narrow crevice hidden behind a mass of thorny brush. It was a suicidal path, a vertical chimney of rock that only a child might scale. He turned to Jorunn Hest, his eyes conveying the desperate plan without a word. She nodded once, her face hardening into a mask of grim, ancestral duty. Arvid slammed the vial of powder against the rock wall, creating a sudden blinding flash of white light. The Garmer recoiled, its sensitive eyes overwhelmed by the sudden chemical brilliance. The raptors shrieked, darting back into the safety of the shadows. Arvid grabbed the nearest child, pushing them toward the hidden crevice in the wall. The tribe surged forward, a desperate mass of limbs and panic, scrambling toward the narrow opening. Arvid stood his ground for a heartbeat longer, his finger hovering over the sparkstone. The Garmer shook its massive head, the haze clearing from its singular, predatory eye. It let out a deafening, resonant thrum that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Arvid scrambled after the tribe, his boots slipping on the loose, treacherous scree. The Garmer lunged, its jaws snapping shut inches from his heel. He dove into the crevice, his chest scraping against the jagged, unyielding basalt. Behind him, the beast slammed into the cliff, the force of the impact sending boulders tumbling down the slope. The tribe huddled in the dark, narrow chimney, their hearts hammering against the stone. They were alive, but they were trapped in the heart of the mountain. Arvid slumped against the rock, his lungs wheezing as the toxic dust settled in his throat. He looked up at the sliver of sky visible through the crack in the stone. The Garmer was pacing outside, its rhythmic, heavy footsteps vibrating through the entire cliffside. It knew they were in the mountain, and it knew there was only one way out. The tribe had traded the open sky for a tomb of cold, suffocating granite. Arvid pulled his journal from his vest, his hands shaking as he traced the ink. The future of the Kalan tribe was no longer a question of strength or spears. It was a question of whether the alchemist could turn the mountain itself into a weapon. He looked at the frightened faces of the children, their eyes reflecting the dim, dying light. The Garmer was waiting, and the hunt had only just begun. The air inside the chimney tasted of wet limestone and ancient dust. Arvid leaned his head against the cold rock, his shallow breaths rattling in his chest. The Garmer's rhythmic pacing continued outside, a heavy thud that shook the mountain's foundations. He opened his satchel, his fingers trembling as he touched the remaining canisters of sulfur. He pulled out his journal, the pages stained with yellow chemical residue and dried blood. He traced a hand-drawn map of the mountain's interior, his eyes lingering on the deep, lower shafts. The sulfur smell was stronger there, a sharp, suffocating scent that clung to his lungs. He looked at the Garmer's tracks near the crevice, noting the creature's deliberate movements. The beast was not just patrolling the mountain, it was guarding something beneath it. He realized the mountain's lower ventilation shafts were linked to the creature's primary nesting ground. The Garmer had driven them into the mountain, but it had also led them to its own heart. Arvid turned to Joran Hest, his face pale and marked by a deep chemical burn. He pointed toward the narrow, dark tunnel that descended into the mountain's roots. Joran studied the path, her eyes narrowing as she gripped the hilt of her stone knife. She understood the implication, her jaw tightening as she looked at the huddled, shivering children. Destroying the nest would kill the sovereign, but it would also bring the entire mountain down. Arvid gathered the remaining charcoal and saltpeter, mixing the components with a steady, clinical focus. His hands were raw and blistered, the skin peeling away from the constant contact with the volatile dust. He packed the mixture into a reinforced leather pouch, his movements deliberate and precise. This final charge was the most unstable concoction he had ever dared to synthesize. It would require a massive spark, one that would likely consume everything in the immediate vicinity. He looked at the children, their faces thin and hollowed by months of starvation and fear. They were the future of the Kalan tribe, provided they survived the coming collapse. Arvid crawled toward the downward slope, the darkness of the tunnel swallowing his silhouette. The air grew hot and humid, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. He reached a wide, cavernous chamber, the walls glistening with moisture and raw mineral deposits. In the center of the pit lay the Garmer's nest, a massive mound of woven bones and dry brush. The beast was absent, likely still prowling the upper entrance to keep the tribe trapped. Arvid placed the explosive charge at the base of a central, load-bearing pillar of rock. He connected a long, thin fuse made of dried, oil-soaked reeds. He retreated slowly, his boots crunching softly against the layer of crushed shells on the floor. The cave felt heavy, the weight of the mountain pressing down on his tired shoulders. He turned back one last time, his gaze sweeping over the vast, subterranean tomb he was about to create. He returned to the chimney, his lungs screaming for oxygen as he climbed the steep, jagged incline. Joran Hest stood at the entrance, her expression grim as she gestured for the tribe to move. They began a silent, desperate crawl toward the higher secondary escape route. Arvid reached the end of the fuse, his fingers fumbling with the spark stone. He glanced at the Garmer's massive footprint in the mud, a final reminder of the threat. He struck the flint, a tiny orange spark jumping into the dry, flammable reed. The fuse hissed, a thin ribbon of gray smoke curling into the stagnant air. He turned and ran, his legs burning with the effort of the climb. Behind him, the spark traveled downward, a trail of light disappearing into the bowels of the mountain. The Garmer roared from the upper entrance, its voice a deafening, discordant sound of pure rage. It had sensed the change, the scent of sulfur and impending fire alerting the apex predator. Arvid reached the upper ledge, the tribe already pushing through the final, narrow opening. The ground beneath them shuddered, a deep, resonant rumble echoing through the granite. A blinding, white flash ignited the lower shafts, turning the darkness into a searing, intense glare. The mountain groaned, a sound of stone grinding against stone that drowned out every other noise. Arvid was thrown forward, his body slamming into the cold, jagged wall of the exit. The floor beneath the nest disintegrated, the entire cavern collapsing into the volcanic vent below. A plume of ash and superheated air roared upward, forcing the tribe to shield their faces. The Garmer's shriek was cut short, silenced by the massive weight of the shifting mountain. Arvid crawled toward the sliver of daylight, his vision blurred by smoke and stinging sweat. He collapsed on the surface, the cool evening air hitting his face like a shock. The mountain behind them was settling, a cloud of gray dust rising to obscure the stars. The Kalan tribe stood on the edge of the ridge, looking down at the ruin of their home. The sovereign was gone, buried under 1,000 tons of shattered, burning granite. Arvid sat in the dirt, his lungs wheezing as he coughed up a thick, black bile. He looked at his hands, the skin blackened and trembling from the final, violent effort. Jorunn Hest approached him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder in a gesture of grim respect. The tribe was alive, but they were now exposed, standing on the edge of a vast, unknown wasteland. The safety of the shadows was gone, replaced by the harsh, open expanse of the surface. Arvid watched the dust settle, his mind already calculating the cost of their survival. The apex predator had been defeated, but the true hunt had only just begun. Dust billowed from the mountain's jagged maw like a funeral shroud. The air tasted of sulfur and pulverized stone. Arvid Vinter lay on his back, his chest heaving with sharp, ragged gasps. Every inhale brought a searing heat into his lungs. He looked at his palms, where the skin hung in blackened, papery strips. The mountain groaned one final time, a deep tremor that shook the ground beneath his boots. Jorunn Hest stood over him, her face caked in a thick layer of gray ash. She looked toward the smoking crater where the Garmer had once ruled. The predator was gone, buried beneath a tomb of shattered granite and molten earth. She turned her gaze back to Arvid, her expression unreadable behind the grime. She reached down, pulling him to his feet with a firm, calloused grip. Arvid leaned against her, his legs trembling like a newborn fawn's. Around them, the remnants of the Kalan tribe emerged from the secondary tunnel. They carried nothing but the few bundles of cured meat they had managed to salvage. The surface world stretched out before them, a vast expanse of rust-colored dirt and dead ferns. The sky was a bruised, unnatural purple, devoid of the familiar cave ceiling. It was an open, terrifying void that offered no protection from the wind. Torstein Skjold stood at the edge of the ridge, his hand resting on the hilt of his stone spear. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrow and searching for hidden threats. He looked at Arvid with a mix of lingering resentment and cold, begrudging respect. The alchemist had saved them, but the cost was the only home they had ever known. Arvid looked at his hands again, his fingers twitching involuntarily. His vision blurred, a dark spot widening in the center of his right eye. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sprayed flecks of dark blood onto the dry earth. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve, hiding the stain from the others. The chemical inhalation was a slow, invisible poison. He knew the biology of it, even if the tribe did not. His lungs were scarred, the delicate tissue hardening from the toxic dust of his own inventions. He looked at the mountain one last time, watching the final plume of smoke dissipate into the cold air. The Garmer had been the apex, but the wasteland was a different kind of predator. Jorunn signaled the tribe to begin the march toward the southern valley. They moved in a tight, silent formation, their eyes darting toward every shadow. Arvid stumbled forward, his boots dragging in the loose volcanic grit. He felt the weight of his journals in his satchel, the blueprints for his thunderfire. The secrets of chemistry were the only inheritance he had to leave behind. He glanced at a group of young orphans trailing behind the main party. They were the next generation of scouts, their faces lean and eyes wide with hunger. He wondered if they would ever know the comfort of a dark, enclosed cave. The wind howled across the plain, carrying the scent of drying moss and distant, carrion-rich swamps. Arvid slowed his pace, his chest burning with every rhythmic step. He stopped near a twisted, petrified tree, his knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small glass vial of purified saltpeter. It was the last of his high-grade supply, a powder as fine as flour. He stared at the white crystals, the source of his power and his inevitable end. Jorunn stopped and turned, watching him from a distance. She did not approach, understanding the isolation that came with his burden. Arvid closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and labored. He saw the Garmer in his mind, its massive scaled hide shivering under the force of the blast. He had conquered the beast, but he had traded his lungs for the victory. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the wasteland. The Kalan tribe was safe for the moment, but they were homeless and exposed. Arvid stood up, his spine arching in a spasm of sharp, stabbing pain. He tucked the vial away and rejoined the line, his stride heavy and uneven. They walked into the darkness, a small, fragile thread of life in a hostile world. The hunt for the future had only just begun. The horizon shimmered with a heat haze that distorted the jagged rocks. Arvid squinted, his breath rattling against the grit-clogged mask he wore. A distant sound cut through the wind, rhythmic and sharp. It was the cadence of heavy drums beating against hollow bone. Jorunn Hest signaled a halt, her hand raised in a rigid command. She pointed toward a ridge where a plume of black smoke rose into the bruised sky. Thorstein Skjold crouched behind a boulder, his spear held at the ready. He gestured for the others to remain low in the volcanic dust. Below them, a valley revealed a sprawling camp of hide tents and woven brush. Strange, reptilian shapes moved between the structures, leashed by thick coils of vine. These were not wild theropods, but smaller, nimble raptors restrained by leather harnesses. A man stood at the center of the camp, shouting commands at a captive handler. He wore a mantle of iridescent scales that caught the dying light of the sun. Arvid peered through a gap in the rocks, his left eye straining against the glare. The stranger held a device made of polished obsidian and braided copper wire. It looked like a crude, scaled-down version of Arvid's own Thunderfire ignition system. Thorstein hissed, his grip tightening on his spear until his knuckles turned white. He whispered that these scavengers had stolen the secrets of the smoke death. Arvid watched as the man in the scale mantle tapped the device against a stone. A spark jumped from the copper wire, followed by a faint chemical scent. It was the smell of sulfur, unmistakable and sharp against the stagnant air. Jorunn lowered her head, her face hardening into a mask of cold resolve. She looked at Arvid, her eyes demanding to know the source of this betrayal. Arvid shook his head, his lungs burning as he fought to keep his breathing steady. He knew the instability of the mixture. It was a miracle they hadn't blown themselves apart. The rival leader turned, his gaze sweeping the horizon with predatory precision. He gestured toward the ridge, his mouth moving in a silent, jagged challenge. A raptor at his feet let out a high, piercing shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. The Kalan tribe retreated into the shadows of a narrow, wind-worn crevice. They huddled together, the air thick with the smell of sweat and impending conflict. Arvid opened his satchel, his fingers brushing the cold glass of a final vial. The rival clan did not just want territory, they wanted the power of the explosion. Thorstein stood at the entrance of the crevice, his eyes fixed on the valley below. He demanded to know if Arvid could build a counterfire to stop the invaders. Arvid looked at his trembling hands, the skin scarred from years of chemical exposure. He realized that technological dominance was a war of attrition they were destined to lose. The sound of claws scraping against stone drifted up from the valley floor. The rival clan was hunting, and they were using the scent of sulfur as a lure. Arvid stood up, his legs heavy, and began to assemble a pile of dry moss. He reached into his pouch for the last of the saltpeter, the white grains catching the light. Jorunn watched him, her expression a mix of fear and an ancient tribal defiance. She understood that the path of the alchemist led only to dust and silence. Arvid ignored her, his focus locked on the mechanical properties of the ignition. He knew that if he fought, he would leave nothing behind but a crater. The raptors began to climb, their talons finding purchase in the sheer rock face. Their eyes glowed with a dull, unnatural light as they sensed the tribe's presence. Arvid ignited the moss, the flame flickering orange against the gathering dark. He did not aim for the beasts, but for the unstable ledge hanging above the camp. The explosion was a low, muffled rumble that shook the mountain to its core. A massive slab of granite groaned, then detached, sliding into the valley below. The rival camp vanished under a cascade of rock, dust, and sudden, absolute silence. Arvid slumped back against the cave wall, his vision tunneling into a sharp, black point. The war for the future had begun, and he had already paid the final price. Jorunn gathered the survivors, her eyes searching the ruins for any sign of movement. There was nothing left but the wind, howling through the wreckage of the ridge. Arvid closed his eyes, the taste of sulfur lingering like a ghost on his tongue. The tribe began their march again, small and fragile against the vast, empty waste. He trailed behind, a silent ghost guiding them toward a horizon he would never reach. Thorstein Skjold stood at the edge of the camp, his shadow stretching long over the dust. He clutched a bundle of cured leather hides against his chest. Tucked inside were the charcoal drawings Arvid had spent months refining. Detailed schematics of the propellant mixture lay exposed to the biting wind. He turned his back on the Kalan encampment without a single backward glance. His boots crunched on the loose shale, marking a path toward the eastern ridge. Arvid Vinter watched from behind a jagged pillar of basalt. He clutched his mask, his fingers trembling against the cold, worn rubber. His left eye throbbed with a dull, persistent ache behind the leather patch. Thorstein slipped into the shadow of a canyon wall, moving with practiced, predatory grace. The traitor knew the patrol routes better than any man in the tribe. He was carrying the future of the Kalan people straight into the hands of their enemies. Arvid looked toward the center of the camp where Jorunn Hest organized the morning water ration. She stood tall, her hands calloused and steady as she measured the meager supplies. If he chased Thorstein, he would leave the tribe defenseless against the next raptor scout. If he stayed, the rival clan would soon master the alchemy of thunderfire. Arvid touched the heavy weight of his last functional pistol tucked into his belt. The mechanism was simple, forged from salvaged iron and tempered by trial and error. It was the only weapon capable of piercing the chitinous armor of the sovereigns. He looked at the empty horizon, his mind racing through the logistics of the loss. Without the propellant, the tribe would be reduced to throwing sticks against living tanks. He took a sharp, rattling breath, the air whistling through his scarred bronchial tubes. He stepped out from behind the basalt pillar, his decision hardening in his gut. He could not let the blueprints reach the rival camp. Arvid moved toward the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground for Thorstein's tracks. The dust was disturbed, showing the deep, purposeful impressions of heavy leather boots. He followed the trail into the winding labyrinth of the lower mountain pass. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh, unforgiving light into the deep crevices. Small, scaly lizards skittered over the rocks, their eyes fixed on the intruder. Arvid kept his hand on the handle of his weapon, his knuckles white. He reached a narrow bridge of stone spanning a deep, dark volcanic fissure. Thorstein stood on the far side, his silhouette framed against the blinding sky. The traitor stopped and turned, his hand resting on the hilt of his spear. He saw Arvid and let out a short, mocking laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. Thorstein held up the bundle of drawings, shaking them like a prize. He shouted that the rival clan would pay him in fresh meat and iron. Arvid stepped onto the bridge, his boots finding purchase on the slick, uneven surface. He warned Thorstein that the propellant was volatile and required precise handling. Thorstein sneered, his grip tightening on the leather bundle until the edges curled. He claimed the rival smiths were smarter than any disgraced alchemist. Arvid raised the pistol, his arm shaking from the lingering damage of the recoil. The metal barrel glinted in the sun, a cold and lethal piece of geometry. Thorstein didn't flinch, his confidence born of years spent hunting in the wastes. He tossed a stone, testing the distance between them on the narrow span. Arvid knew he had only one shot before the mechanism required a long reload. He watched Thorstein's feet, noting the slight imbalance in his defensive stance. The traitor was preparing to charge, his spear leveled at Arvid's exposed chest. Arvid adjusted his aim, his breath hitching as the chemical burn flared in his lungs. He thought of the orphans back in the cave, their health fading from the toxic dust. He could not let the war for the future end in a pile of ash. Thorstein lunged, his muscles coiled like a spring, his spear tip flashing forward. Arvid pulled the trigger, the sound of the ignition snapping like a whip. A gout of orange flame erupted from the barrel, pushing a lead slug through the air. The impact struck the rock near Thorstein's feet, sending a spray of shrapnel upward. Thorstein stumbled, his eyes widening as the force of the blast knocked him back. The leather bundle slipped from his fingers, tumbling over the edge of the bridge. It plummeted into the dark, churning abyss of the volcanic fissure below. Thorstein let out a roar of frustration and scrambled to reach the falling papers. He leaned too far, his center of gravity shifting over the crumbling ledge. The stone gave way with a sharp, grinding sound of rock shearing against rock. Thorstein clawed at the air, his fingers raking uselessly against the smooth basalt. He vanished into the darkness, his scream cut short by the hollow wind. Arvid stood on the bridge, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. He looked down into the depths, but the blueprints were gone, lost to the fire depths. He holstered the pistol, his hand trembling so violently he could barely secure the strap. The silence returned to the pass, heavy and suffocatingly absolute. He turned away from the edge, his legs feeling like they were carved from lead. The return journey to the camp felt longer, every step a labor of endurance. He arrived at the cave entrance as the moon began to rise over the jagged peaks. Jorunn Hest stood at the threshold, her face unreadable in the flickering torchlight. She looked at his empty hands and the soot-stained fabric of his tunic. She did not ask about Thorstein, but her eyes held a silent, searching question. Arvid walked past her, his gaze fixed on the ground as he entered the dark. The tribe was safe for another night, but the tactical edge was gone forever. He slumped onto his bed of hides, his body aching from the strain of the hunt. He closed his eyes, the image of the falling blueprints haunting his internal view. He knew the rival clan would eventually reconstruct the chemistry through their own suffering. The war had moved from the shadows into the light of a new, violent era. He reached into his pouch, his fingers finding a single, small vial of saltpeter. It was not enough for a weapon, but it was enough to start a new experiment. He would build something better, something that didn't require blueprints to understand. The future belonged to those who could survive the cost of their own inventions. He drifted into a shallow sleep, his lungs rattling with every labored, rhythmic breath. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint, distant scent of a hunting sovereign. Arvid knelt before the stone basin in the corner of the mountain forge. His breath rattled in his chest, a wet, metallic sound that echoed against the cave walls. He pulled a tattered piece of hide from his belt, revealing a list of chemical ratios. The current propellant was too volatile, searing the lungs of the orphans who helped him manufacture it. He needed a stabilizer, a rare blue-veined mineral found only in the deepest, sulfur-rich basins. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with the black residue of 1,000 failed experiments. A map, etched onto the wall, showed the nesting grounds of the pack raptors 3 miles to the east. Arvid stood up, his joints popping with a dull, sickening ache. He grabbed his heavy leather tunic and pulled it over his head, the fabric stiff with dried grime. He checked the mechanism of his single-shot pistol, ensuring the firing pin remained functional. He stepped out of the forge, the cold mountain air biting at his exposed skin. The path ahead wound through a series of narrow, treacherous limestone ridges. Below, the valley floor was a sea of dense, fog-covered ferns. He moved silently, his boots finding purchase on the slick, mossy rock. A low, guttural chittering sound drifted up from the shadows of the valley. Arvid pressed himself against a jagged boulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 raptors patrolled the ravine, their bodies sleek and covered in iridescent, chitinous armor. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity that mimicked the hunting patterns of the Kalan. Arvid watched as they stopped, their heads cocking in unison to track a scent on the wind. He knew their intelligence surpassed any creature that had walked the earth before the Great Collapse. They were learning, adapting to the sounds of his weapons with each passing moon. He crept forward, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the nesting zone. A cluster of glowing blue crystals jutted from the red earth near the center of the clearing. He tightened his grip on his belt, feeling the weight of his remaining powder pouches. He needed enough of the mineral to stabilize a full batch of propellant for the tribe. He waited for the raptors to move toward the far ridge, their tails twitching in the dim light. He sprinted across the open ground, his boots silent on the loose shale. He reached the mineral deposit and began prying at the stone with a sharpened iron chisel. The rock splintered with a sharp crack that echoed across the quiet nesting ground. One of the raptors spun around, its pupils dilating as it fixed its gaze on the intruder. It let out a piercing, high-pitched screech that brought the other 2 sprinting back. Arvid shoved the blue shards into his pouch, his movements frantic and precise. He drew his pistol, the cold steel barrel steady despite the tremor in his arm. The lead raptor lunged, its claws scraping against the stone floor like grinding knives. Arvid fired, the ignition flash blindingly bright in the twilight of the ravine. The lead predator tumbled backward, its bio-armor shattered by the concussive force of the blast. The other 2 skidded to a halt, their teeth bared in a snarl of confusion and rage. Arvid didn't wait for them to recover, turning to scramble up the steep face of the ridge. His lungs burned with the effort, the toxic air feeling like jagged glass in his throat. He climbed until his fingers bled, the sound of tearing claws echoing just feet below him. He reached the summit and collapsed, his body shaking from the sheer exertion of the escape. He pulled the blue mineral from his pouch, holding it up to the pale moonlight. It was enough to refine the mixture, enough to ensure the tribe's defense for another winter. He looked back at the darkening valley, the raptors circling the base of the climb. They would follow him, their patience as enduring as their hunger. He stood up, his legs trembling as he turned toward the distant, hidden path to the cave. The cost of his survival was etched into his own failing, chemical-scarred body. He walked into the night, the weight of the future heavy in his trembling, soot-stained hands. The canyon floor shook under the rhythmic thud of approaching boots. Torstein Skjold emerged from the tree line, his chest armored in scavenged plates. Behind him, 20 warriors from the rival clan gripped crude, iron-barreled pistols. They held the weapons with the stiff, nervous posture of novices. The Kalan tribe huddled near the cavern entrance, their spears leveled in defense. Torstein raised his arm, signaling his scouts to fan out across the ridge. A blue flicker of chemical ignition sparked in the hand of a rival hunter. The crack of a gunshot shattered the silence of the mountain pass. A Kalan scout slumped forward, a jagged hole blooming in his leather tunic. Arvid Vinter watched from the shadows of the high ledge, his breath rattling inside his mask. He gripped his own heavy, brass-fitted pistol, his knuckles white against the metal. The rival clan fired a ragged volley, the acrid scent of sulfur filling the air. Lead balls whistled through the brush, striking stone and spraying granite dust. The Kalan survivors scrambled for cover, their traditional spears useless against the distance. Torstein laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the metallic ringing of the gunfire. He waved his men forward, eager to claim the cave and its hidden stores. The constant, rhythmic popping of the stolen gunpowder designs echoed against the canyon walls. Then, the sound changed. From the deep, dark forests to the north, a high-pitched, harmonic chittering arose. The rival hunters paused, their weapons lowered, eyes darting toward the dense canopy. Leaves parted as a swarm of raptors poured into the clearing like a living tide. They were not the small, solitary pack raptors Arvid had encountered in the sulfur basins. These were giants, their chitinous scales shimmering with iridescent bruised purples and blacks. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized intelligence that ignored the human combatants. Torstein fired his pistol at the nearest beast, the lead ball glancing off its armored skull. The raptor didn't flinch. It lunged, its claws scything through the air in a blur. The rival hunter vanished beneath a mass of thrashing limbs and snapping, serrated jaws. The battlefield erupted into a chaotic, bloody swirl of panicked men and predatory hunger. Arvid watched the massacre, his hand trembling as he adjusted the release valve on his pouch. The gunfire had acted as a dinner bell, drawing every apex predator for miles. A massive sovereign emerged from the brush, its tail clearing a path through the trees. It ignored the Kalan tribe, focusing its golden, slit-pupil eyes on the rival clan. The rival warriors turned their guns toward the new threat, firing wildly into the fray. Each shot only brought more raptors, their shrieks rising to an unbearable, deafening pitch. Torstein tried to scramble up the limestone face, his boots slipping on blood-slicked stone. A raptor leaped, catching his ankle in its jaws and dragging him back into the gore. Arvid saw the tribe's path to the upper tunnels closing as the raptors swarmed the base. He realized the rival clan had brought their own doom into the heart of the valley. He reached into his satchel, pulling out a heavy, wax-sealed canister of volatile propellant. The mixture was unstable, its volatile nature capable of leveling the entire ravine. He stood up on the ledge, the wind whipping his thin, graying hair across his face. He looked down at the slaughterhouse below, where human and beast fought for scraps. The Sovereign King moved into the center of the clearing, its hide scarred from past explosions. It raised its head, letting out a roar that vibrated the very marrow in Arvid's bones. Arvid primed the fuse, his fingers burning as the caustic dust touched his raw skin. He knew the blast would be the final act of his long, chemical-fueled crusade. He tossed the canister, watching it arc through the air like a dying star. It landed at the feet of the Sovereign King, right between the warring factions. The world turned white as the volatile mixture tore through the air and stone. The shockwave threw raptors and warriors alike against the jagged canyon walls. Dust and debris choked the sky, blotting out the pale, uncaring moon. Arvid collapsed against the cliffside, his lungs failing as the toxic smoke drifted upward. He watched the valley floor through a haze of settling ash and rising heat. The raptors were scattered, their chitinous armor cracked and useless against the concussive force. The rival clan was gone, their ambition buried under a mountain of broken, scorched earth. The Kalan tribe remained huddled in the higher reaches, shielded by the ledge of the cave. They looked toward the summit, searching for the man who had traded his life for theirs. Arvid leaned his head back against the cold stone, his vision fading into a soft, dark gray. The silence returned to the mountain, heavy and absolute, broken only by the settling of rocks. He had built a future, but he would not be there to see it unfold. The last of his strength ebbed away, leaving his hands empty and still. Below, the valley floor grew quiet, the era of the hunter and the hunted finally shifting. A new age began in the ashes, written in the blood and fire of a forgotten mind. The acrid scent of phosphorus hung heavy in the cooling air. Arvid Vinter knelt on the jagged limestone, his lungs burning with every shallow breath. He clutched a shattered glass vial, the last of his volatile chemical reserves. Below him, the raptor swarm circled the Kalan tribe in a tight, predatory ring. The beasts clicked their serrated jaws, their iridescent scales rippling in the dying light. Jorun Hest stood before the terrified survivors, her spear trembling in her calloused grip. She looked up at the ledge, her eyes locking with Arvid's for a single silent second. Arvid recognized the look of absolute resignation in the High Matriarch's face. He turned his gaze toward his satchel, now empty of all but a few scraps of sulfur. He reached for the phosphor-coated rods he had salvaged from the mountain forge. His fingers were raw, the skin peeling away in thin, blackened strips from years of toxic exposure. He struck the rods against the rough stone of the cavern wall. A blinding, white-hot spark erupted in the gloom of the mountain pass. The phosphorus ignited instantly, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon floor. Arvid threw the burning mass into the center of the raptor pack. A thick, opaque cloud of white smoke billowed outward with an explosive hiss. The raptors shrieked, their sensitive eyes overwhelmed by the sudden, searing luminescence. They thrashed blindly, their claws raking against the solid rock instead of human flesh. The Kalan tribe hesitated, staring at the wall of unnatural fog. Arvid waved his arms, shouting for them to move toward the narrow mountain chimney. Joran didn't question the command, pushing the children forward into the dense chemical haze. The tribe vanished into the swirling white curtains, their silhouettes fading like ghosts. Arvid watched the raptors stumble through the smoke, their movements erratic and confused. He gripped his heavy, brass-fitted pistol, though the barrel was cold and empty. He knew he had no more propellant to hold the line. The Sovereign King moved at the edge of the smoke, its golden eyes piercing the gloom. It let out a low, guttural vibration that shook the loose grit from the ceiling. Arvid stood up, his legs buckling as the toxic fumes filled his damaged lungs. He pulled his mask tighter to his face, though the leather was cracked and porous. The beast lunged, its massive head snapping through the air where Arvid had stood seconds before. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the slick, blood-stained stone. The raptors began to emerge from the smoke, their hunger sharper than their confusion. Arvid reached into his belt and pulled a single small flask of concentrated saltpeter. He smashed it against the ledge, the resulting flash momentarily blinding the lead predator. He turned and sprinted toward the narrow chimney, his chest heaving with every step. The sharp, metallic taste of iron coated his tongue. He reached the opening, squeezing his body through the jagged fissure in the granite. Behind him, the raptors slammed into the rock, their claws sparking against the stone. He hauled himself upward, his fingers scraping raw against the freezing mountain wall. He reached the upper plateau, where the rest of the tribe waited in the dark. Joran caught his arm, her face pale in the faint moonlight. She looked at his bleeding hands and the gray pallor of his skin. He shook his head, motioning for the group to continue higher into the peaks. They moved in silence, a ragged line of survivors climbing away from the valley floor. Below them, the raptors prowled the base of the chimney, unable to follow the steep ascent. The valley remained a cauldron of smoke and predatory, frustrated shrieks. Arvid looked back one final time at the ruins of his chemical workshop. The fire he had started was already dying, leaving only the smell of burnt minerals. He turned his back on the valley, his resolve hardening despite the physical pain. They had lost their supplies, their shelter, and their sense of security. But they were alive, and the knowledge of the thunder fire remained in his head. He followed the tribe into the high mountain passes, his breathing ragged and rhythmic. Each step was a struggle against the encroaching weakness in his limbs. He looked at the young orphans walking ahead, their faces etched with newfound fear. He realized his work had cost them their childhood, yet offered them a future. They reached a hidden shelf in the cliffside, sheltered from the biting mountain wind. Joran ordered the tribe to stop and rest, her voice low and authoritative. She sat beside Arvid, watching the horizon for any sign of the raptor pack. Arvid leaned against the stone, his eyes closing as the adrenaline began to fade. He needed to synthesize a new propellant, one that would not require such deadly ingredients. He began to trace patterns in the dust, mapping out a new, safer formula. His hands were unsteady, but his mind remained clear and focused on the task. The Kalan tribe settled into the dark, their survival now hanging by a fragile thread. They were no longer hunters, but refugees in a world that wanted them extinct. Arvid watched the stars, feeling the weight of the coming war with the rival clans. He knew they would come looking for the secret of the fire dust soon. He would be ready for them, even if he had to burn the world to protect his own. The mountain air grew colder as the night deepened around them. The tribe huddled together for warmth, their breathing sinking in the quiet dark. Arvid looked at his scorched palms, a grim smile touching his cracked lips. The gambit had succeeded, but the true cost was only just beginning to show. The peaks tore into the bruised purple clouds like jagged teeth. Arvid dragged his heavy pack across the frozen scree. Each breath rattled in his chest like loose gravel in a drum. He stopped at a natural alcove carved into the granite face. The wind howled, whipping snow into swirling white pillars. He dropped his pack, the metal tools clattering against the stone. His lungs burned with the familiar acidic sting of his work. He leaned against the rock, his skin pale and slick with cold sweat. The forge needed to be hidden, insulated from the biting gale. He began dragging flat slabs of slate to block the entrance. His movements were slow, deliberate, and pained. He hammered a steel spike into the floor to anchor his workstation. The sound rang out, sharp and lonely against the mountain silence. He laid his charcoal reserves in a neat protective circle. The sulfur crystals sat in a leather pouch at his belt. These were the last of his stable reagents from the valley. He squinted through his remaining eye at the horizon. The vast, empty tundra stretched out beneath the high cliffs. He moved to the rear of the cave to inspect a strange formation. A series of smooth, circular indentations lined a back wall. They were not natural erosion, but deliberate, rhythmic strikes. He touched the stone, feeling the unnatural smoothness of the gouges. His pulse quickened, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. He pulled a small torch from his belt and held it to the wall. The light revealed a pile of sharpened obsidian shards at his feet. They were lashed together with braided sinew in a crude knot. A tool. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He backed away, his boots crunching on the frozen dust. The shadows in the corner of the cave seemed to deepen. A low, vibrating hum resonated through the floorboards of the cliff. It was a sound of intelligence, not the mindless shriek of a raptor. He reached for his pistol, but his fingers trembled against the trigger. The air in the cave grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone. A massive shape detached itself from the gloom of the ceiling. It was a sovereign king, its scales shimmering with a dull, iridescent oil. It stood on two powerful legs, its forelimbs ending in elongated, dexterous claws. It held a jagged piece of flint, turning the edge over with a flick of its wrist. The beast watched him, its golden eyes calculating his distance and posture. It did not rush, did not roar, did not display the usual predatory frenzy. It simply observed, a hunter who understood the concept of a trap. Arvid scrambled for his bag, his hand diving for the saltpeter. The sovereign king tilted its head, a motion that mimicked Arvid's own confusion. It dropped the flint and reached for a heavy stone club resting near its feet. Arvid realized the cave was not his refuge, but a deliberate killing floor. The beast had been waiting, learning the rhythm of the mountain weather. He threw a handful of sulfur dust toward the monster's face. The powder caught in the air, creating a shimmering, yellow curtain. The sovereign king stepped back, its movements fluid and strangely graceful. It swung the club, the heavy wood whistling through the thin mountain air. Arvid ducked, the wind of the blow ruffling his matted hair. He slammed his flint striker against the stone, sparking a small flame. The fire caught the loose powder on the floor, erupting in a sudden blinding flash. The cave lit up with a harsh, sulphurous glow that pushed the shadows back. The beast hissed, shielding its eyes with a scaled, armored arm. Arvid backed toward the narrow fissure that led to the upper plateau. He grabbed his satchel, his fingers clutching the cold brass of his pistol. The sovereign king recovered, its golden eyes narrowed to thin, lethal slits. It lunged, its claws scraping sparks against the solid granite wall. Arvid fired his pistol, the recoil snapping his wrist backward. The ball struck the beast's shoulder, chipping a piece of its bio-armor. It staggered, letting out a sound that was half scream and half human grunt. Arvid squeezed through the opening, his body scraping against the sharp stone. He tumbled onto the ledge, the wind catching him like a leaf. He did not look back, sprinting toward the hidden camp of the Kalan tribe. His lungs screamed for oxygen, the cold air freezing his throat. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of the creature following him. It was not hunting by scent, but by the logic of his own escape path. He reached a narrow bridge of ice spanning a deep, black chasm. He stopped, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He knew the bridge would not hold the weight of a sovereign king. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small glass vial of concentrated oil. He smashed it against the base of the ice, the liquid seeping into the cracks. He struck a match and tossed it into the puddle of volatile fuel. The ice hissed, then fractured with a sound like a thunderclap. The sovereign king reached the edge, its claws digging into the permafrost. It stopped, staring across the widening gap at the small, broken man. Arvid stood on the far side, his face smeared with soot and blood. The beast let out a low, mournful vibration that echoed through the peaks. It turned its back on him, walking away into the swirling mountain mist. Arvid collapsed on the frozen ground, his strength finally leaving him. He had survived, but he had discovered a predator that could learn. The war had shifted, moving from the valley to the very top of the world. He looked at his shaking hands, realizing the forge was no longer enough. He needed to teach the tribe to think, not just to survive. He stared into the dark, the silhouette of the mountain looming like a tomb. The Kalan tribe waited in the distance, oblivious to the new intelligence in the peaks. He stood up, his legs trembling as he turned toward the campfire light. The night was long, and the true hunt was only just beginning. Arvid sat at the stone workbench, his chest hitching with every shallow breath. He reached for the leather mask resting on the table. The fabric was stained with a permanent dark residue of sulfur and charcoal. He pulled the straps tight, the leather biting into his weathered skin. His lungs rattled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet cavern. Across the room, Era watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. She clutched a heavy iron chisel, her knuckles white against the cold metal. Arvid motioned for her to approach the workbench. He spread a piece of cured hide across the flat surface. With a shaking finger, he traced a crude map of the mountain's vent systems. He pointed to the main ignition chamber, his movements slow and deliberate. Era leaned in, her hair falling forward to shadow her face. He tapped the diagram, then pointed toward the northern tunnel. He gestured for her to lead the tribe toward the lower plateau. Era shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. Arvid gripped her shoulder, his hand heavy and trembling. He pushed a small brass-bound journal into her calloused palms. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of chemical ratios and ignition sequences. He pointed to the final entry, marked with a warning symbol in red ink. Era looked at the text, then back at his pale, sunken face. Arvid stood up, his legs buckling before he caught himself on the stone wall. He grabbed a satchel filled with the last of their volatile saltpeter stores. He walked toward the cavern entrance, his gait uneven and pained. The air outside the cave smelled of ozone and encroaching winter. He turned back one last time, watching the girl stand in the firelight. She looked like a leader, her posture rigid with a newfound terrible purpose. Arvid turned toward the dark tunnels leading to the Sovereign King's nest. He checked the flint striker at his belt, ensuring the steel was clean. The walls of the corridor were slick with moisture and ancient dust. He found a narrow crevice and began wedging the explosive charges into the rock. His lungs burned, each breath a jagged needle of ice and chemical dust. He ignored the pain, focusing only on the placement of the fuses. He linked the charges with braided sinew dipped in flammable oil. The network of fire dust stretched across the floor like a spiderweb. He retreated to the central junction, his vision blurring at the edges. A low, rhythmic scraping sound emerged from the darkness ahead. The Sovereign King was moving, its scales clicking against the granite. Arvid leaned against the cool stone, his hand hovering over the striker. He pulled the mask lower, sealing it against his skin to filter the toxic air. The creature's silhouette appeared, a massive, shifting shadow in the gloom. It paused, its head tilting to catch the scent of sulfur and sweat. Arvid stepped into the light, his pistol held steady in his right hand. The beast hissed, a sound that vibrated in the very marrow of his bones. He watched the predator's golden eyes lock onto his chest. It did not rush, waiting for him to make the first mistake. Arvid struck his flint, the spark bright against the oppressive dark. The flame jumped to the fuse, a thin line of fire racing toward the floor. He turned and sprinted toward the narrow exit, his boots sliding on the grit. The world behind him erupted in a roar of white heat and flying stone. The ceiling of the tunnel collapsed, burying the passage in a mountain of debris. Arvid was thrown forward, his body slamming into the far wall of the fissure. Dust and smoke choked the air, thick enough to sting his eyes. He collapsed to his knees, his hands clawing at the rocky floor. The sound of the explosion faded into a ringing silence that filled his head. He looked up at the ceiling, seeing the light of the surface filtering through. The tribe was safe, moving toward the lower valleys far below. He took one final, rattling breath, the mask feeling heavy against his face. His fingers brushed the stone, feeling the vibration of the earth settling. The hunt was over, and the future was no longer his to carry. He let his head fall back, his eyes closing as the darkness claimed him. Above, the mountains stood silent, a tomb for the man who brought fire. Era stood at the edge of the plateau, looking back at the smoking peak. She clutched the journal to her chest, her expression hardened by the loss. She turned away from the shadow of the mountain, leading her people forward. The path ahead was long, but the secret of the thunderfire remained. The era of the prey was ending, and the age of the hunter had begun. The heavy iron doors of the fortress groaned under a massive, rhythmic pressure. A claw, thick as a tree trunk and serrated like a jagged blade, punched through the reinforced stone. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating the floor in a layer of suffocating gray powder. Arvid Vinter stood in the center of the laboratory, his breathing ragged behind the cracked leather mask. His lungs burned with every shallow intake of toxic air. He adjusted the leather straps, his fingers moving with a frantic, practiced precision. Across the chamber, a wall of glass vials held his life's work: volatile saltpeter and refined sulfur. The Sovereign King roared, a sound that shattered the remaining stone lanterns in the hall. The creature's snout, armored in chitinous plates the color of dried blood, pushed through the splintered doorway. Its golden eyes scanned the room, locking instantly onto the frail man standing among the tables. Arvid stepped backward, his boots sliding on the grit of shattered chemical jars. He pulled a single, heavy flint striker from his belt. The Sovereign King lunged, its massive body moving with a speed that defied its immense weight. Arvid dodged to the left, his movements stiff and pained from years of chemical exposure. The creature's tail whipped through the air, smashing a stone pillar into jagged shrapnel. Arvid scrambled toward the main storage vat, his shadow dancing against the flickering orange light. He reached the primary ignition point, a network of braided sinew dipped in flammable oil. The Sovereign King paused, its nostrils flaring as it caught the sharp, acrid scent of the sulfur stores. It hissed, a low vibration that rattled the brass instruments on the nearby shelves. Arvid looked toward the hidden ventilation shaft, where Era and the tribe were currently descending. He knew their path was clear, but the floor beneath him trembled with the beast's approach. He placed his hand on the final fuse, his palm slick with cold sweat. The Sovereign King stepped forward, its claws scraping against the uneven floorboards. The predator did not attack, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Arvid looked the beast in the eye, his expression hidden behind the dark, stained mask. He thought of the long, silent nights spent hunched over his journals in the freezing dark. He struck the flint, the spark bright and sharp against the gloom of the fortress. The flame touched the oil-soaked sinew, a thin line of fire racing toward the chemical vats. Arvid didn't run, his legs refusing to obey the instinct for survival. The Sovereign King shrieked, finally sensing the danger, and turned to bolt back toward the exit. It was too late. The explosion began as a pinprick of white light in the center of the storage room. A roar of concussive force ripped through the cavern, turning the stone walls into a spray of lethal debris. Arvid was lifted from the floor, his body consumed by the sudden blinding heat. The roof of the mountain fortress groaned, then collapsed in a final, thunderous descent. Dust billowed out from the mountain's peak, rising into the cold, thin air of the upper plateau. Below, the ground shook, sending tremors through the rock face where the tribe had taken shelter. Era reached the base of the valley, her hand tightening around the strap of Arvid's journal. She stopped and looked back, watching the plume of smoke rising from the fortress. The mountain stood silent once more, a tomb for the man who brought the thunderfire. The air grew still, the silence of the wasteland returning to the archipelago. She turned away from the ruin, leading her people into the uncharted wilderness of the surface. The era of the prey had ended in that final scorching flash of light. A new age began, forged in the ashes of the alchemist's last desperate sacrifice. The dust cloud stretched for miles across the jagged horizon. The silence that followed the blast was absolute and heavy. Era stood on the ridge, her boots sinking into the fine gray ash. She clutched the leather-bound journal against her chest. The mountain fortress was gone, replaced by a jagged, smoking crater. She looked down at her hands, still trembling from the concussive force. Below her, the survivors of the Kalan tribe huddled in the shadow of a stone overhang. They stared at the ruin of their sanctuary with hollow, wide-eyed expressions. Joran Hest walked toward Era, her face smeared with soot. The matriarch looked at the empty space where the peak had stood. She said nothing, merely placing a calloused hand on Era's shoulder. Era opened the journal, the pages crinkled and stained by saltpeter. She traced the diagrams of the flint striker and the chemical ratios. The ink was dark, precise, and cold, reflecting the mind that wrote it. She realized then that Arvid Vinter had not just fought for their lives. He had rewritten the rules of the world they occupied. The sovereigns no longer held the monopoly on absolute dominance. She saw a sketch of a new, more stable propellant in the margins. It was a map to a future where humanity did not have to hide. But the cost of that map was written in the ash beneath her feet. She looked up, scanning the distant, hazy tree line of the valley. A low, guttural vibration hummed through the soles of her boots. It was not the tremor of a collapsing mountain. It was a rhythmic, intelligent sound, echoing from the deep forests. The Sovereign King was dead, but the vacuum of power was already filling. She closed the journal, the weight of the legacy pressing into her palms. The tribe looked to her, waiting for a command that would define their new reality. She turned toward the uncharted wilderness, her path clear but dangerous. The age of the hunter had arrived, and the predators were learning to adapt. You watch the screen, but the static in the distance is drawing closer to you. The fire didn't end the hunt. It only gave the monsters a reason to evolve. You are not a spectator in this cycle. The shadow is already shifting, and the next explosion is yours to trigger.